Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Thoughtful Bro. I'm here with Julian Brave NoiseCat, and I can't wait to get into this interview today. You know I love a good father-son story, and I am not blowing smoke when I say this is one of the greatest and most improbable and jaw-dropping father-son stories I've ever read. I just can't wait to unpack the whole odyssey that Julian has been on the last few years through being an Oscar-nominated director and then writing this absolutely fantastic book. But before we get to all that, a few words to start. We are live streaming on A Mighty Blaze on Facebook and YouTube as always, and the Thoughtful Bro is always here to talk about what makes great books tick and what makes great authors tick. We're an all-volunteer initiative at A Mighty Blaze, and we connect writers and readers virtually. We're never asking for money. If you want to show us the love, just like us and follow us and tell your friends about us and repost us all that you can. But if you are in the mood to spend money, I do have an idea for you. I would spend it on books of heart-rending journalism and cultural history, books that unearth the truth buried in our lands, books that discuss the healing power of myth, and above all, books that tell an improbable father-son journey. Books like We Survived the Night by Julian Brave NoiseCat. We're going to put a link to buy that in the chat through bookshop.org. Support your indies. And regarding questions, post them in the comments, and we'll try to get to them at the end. On to this week's guest. Julian Brave NoiseCat is a writer, filmmaker, and champion powwow dancer. His first documentary, Sugarcane, follows an investigation into abuse and missing children at the Indian residential school NoiseCat's family was sent to near Williams Lake, British Columbia. The film was recognized with 40 awards, including Best Documentary from the National Board of Review, and was nominated for a Peabody and an Academy Award. His writing has appeared in dozens of publications, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, and in 2021, he was named to the Time 100 Next list of emerging leaders. His first book, We Survived the Night, was an instant national bestseller in Canada and an indie bestseller in the United States. It was listed as one of the New Yorker's best books of the year so far. It is told in the style of a coyote story and interweaves indigenous oral history, journalism, and personal anecdotes. The result is what Publishers Weekly called, quote, a powerful archive of indigenous pain and resistance. And Tommy Orange, the great Tommy Orange, said, Julian Brave NoiseCat has written a book I've been waiting to read my whole life. Julian Brave NoiseCat, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thanks for having me, Mark. So excited to be here. Coming to you live, by the way, from behind the wheel of my own truck. So fully embodying the thoughtful bro, archetype, I guess, here.
In a rest stop, no less.
In a rest stop in Washington State. I crossed the border about 30 minutes ago. So
amazing. All right. So I have so much I want to talk to you about today. I really was like binging on the film and the book and just your story and all the coverage of it all the last week, but right up till almost the interview started, I was kind of geeking out on everything about this. I just am sort of obsessed with the book and the film. I think just a few things to say right off the top is just, I think what draws me to this book is the way that it shows that the power of myth can be healing in a way that nothing else is. And I just found that really moving, and I can't wait to unpack the myth aspect of it. But why don't we just start though with the film? I mean, the film came first. The film came out, I think, last year, and you were at the Academy Awards earlier this year. Can we just start there and talk about the origin of the film, and then we'll get into kind of how it dovetails with the book?
So the film has a really, truly wild origin story. So about 4 years ago now, a little over 4 years ago now, my friend and colleague, Emily Cassie, who I worked my first and only real journalism job with, I was the Native Issues Fellow at the Huffington Post the summer after I graduated from college and before I went to graduate school. And they didn't really know what to do with me at the HuffPost. They had never had a Native Issues Fellow before, and I don't think that they've had one since. And that included not knowing where to seat me in the newsroom. And so there happened to be an open desk next to Emily, who had a real job with the HuffPost. The Native Issues Fellow, I got paid it was something like $10 an hour to be like a beat reporter on Indian affairs across the United States and Canada. M was the creative director of Highline, which was HuffPost's like online magazine. They did one big story a week, and so she would, shoot it. She would creative direct it. Design the web page. This was back. Some of your listeners might remember, but this was back in the day when you would like scroll through an article on the internet and it might have all these different effects on it. There was
Yeah.
like an era of online journalism where they were really into doing different stuff like that. So
I
that
think that
was
was like
M.
3 eras ago.
Yeah, well, so this is the joke with M is that M made her whole career during what was called the pivot to video
Okay.
in journalism, which is over now. But if you guys remember, there was a moment in time where everybody was kind of chasing the market that Vice created for online journalism, where they had all these videos, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so all these newsrooms were hiring video journalists, and M was a video journalist who was really talented, documentarian, and so she sort of made her career in that pivot to video, which is now over. And so we had sat next to each other. We both happen to be Canadian. She grew up in Toronto. My father's side of the family is First Nations from British Columbia. We never worked together per se, but we were about the same age, so we'd get lunch together, and we kept in touch in the decades since we sat next to each other. And then in May of 2021, an international headline hit the news. Some of your listeners might remember it. There were 215 potential unmarked graves of children discovered at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, which is actually a institution that my own family was sent to. It's where my grandmother uh, finished high school and then began studying nursing. And after that discovery, Em reached out to me and said, "Hey, would you be open to collaborating with me on a documentary about the Indian residential schools?" She felt really drawn to the story because she's Jewish, so she had her own familial connections to the legacy of the Holocaust. And also, she's Canadian, and so she had done all this reporting on human rights atrocities around the world, but had never turned her lens on her own country, and she felt really
Mm.
grateful to this story. So she reached out to me, and I had just signed the contract for We Survived the Night, and I'd never written a book before. I had never even directed a TikTok, and so making a movie and writing a book at the same time felt like maybe a little much. And more to the point, my family's connection to the Indian residential schools is a really intense thing. I didn't know all the particulars of the story, but I knew that there was a really intense and heavy story there. And so I told Em, that I had to think about her offer, and I took about 2 weeks to think about it. And then while I was doing that, Em went and found an article in the Williams Lake Tribune about another First Nation that was about to begin its own investigation at the nearby residential school near its reserve. And that First Nation was the Williams Lake First Nation, and that school was called St. Joseph's Mission. And so when I finally got back to M, like literally 2 weeks later, because I really did take my time with it, and told her, hey, about that documentary, I'd be open to collaborating with you on it. That's when she told me that she had identified this First Nation that was beginning the search, and that search was happening at St. Joseph's Mission, which, when she said that, was like completely stunning to me because, of
Yeah.
course, that was the school that my family was sent to, and where my father, to the best of my knowledge at the time, was born and found in a dumpster. And that was all I really ever had known about that story. And so that set of events, I mean, just to like give your listeners a sense for the improbability of this happening, there were 139 schools across Canada. So she happened to choose the one school that my family was sent to and where my father was born. What are the odds of that? Um, Secondly, what were the odds that we were seated next to each other in a newsroom in New York, two Canadians?
Yeah.
What's the odds that she was a filmmaker? What's the odds that she was a filmmaker who would want to make their first documentary on this subject? And what was the odds that she'd be seated next to not just any native, which is super improbable in a newsroom, by the way. There's not that many of us in these art forms, but the son of the only known survivor of the incinerator at that very school, St. Joseph's Mission. I mean, all of it, I think, um, is incredibly. It makes you wonder, what are the things that that align the improbabilities of the world that make things
Yeah.
happen. Um, And that obviously also set in front of me a bunch of not just significant creative decisions, but life decisions about how I was going to confront this enormous story, what in Canada they call a cultural genocide against my people.
And I have to say, I, like many viewers, I now understand, was totally unprepared for how horrifying it really was. I mean, I'm glad you brought up, how your co-director, she had this connection to the Holocaust through being Jewish. It really made me think about the Holocaust. I mean, it was one of really the most horrific things I'd ever read about things that happened in America or North America, and of course, it makes you think like this is just one story. How many other stories are there like this? The film has been received rapturously. I mean, it's not just the Academy Award. I think it's like 100% on excuse me, on Rotten Tomatoes. I wanted to just take a moment and rewind to the story about your father and how he was found, because this to me is, I mean, talk about improbability. I mean,
Mhm.
I feel like everything you just said about how improbable it was that this film was made, it seems to me by an order of magnitude, the improbability of your father's survival is something else.
Yeah, so my father, and this is the first scene in the book. If you want to hear me tell it a little bit more eloquently, I recommend you pick up a copy of We Survived the Night. And that's not a plug. That's just like me making a case for the better version of the story than I can give on
Yeah.
the podcast. But my dad, to get into like a kind of heavy story, I guess. My father was born on the night of August 16, 1959, and found a few minutes later in the trash incinerator at St. Joseph's Mission by the night watchman at the school, a Dutchman who only spoke broken English. His name was Tony Stoop. And he described my father's cries for life as sounding like the noise of a cat to the local newspaper, which is another detail that, again, makes you wonder, because, of course, my last name is NoiseCat. And um, Tony went looking for that whale, which led him to the trash incinerator, where he found a baby in a ice cream carton, a milk carton. Um, and the authorities called that baby Baby X. And of course, that baby was my father. And of course, he survived. I mean, that's how I'm here. Um, to get to the name piece of this, that is another example of like what are the forces at work here. Our last name, NoiseCat, actually only became NoiseCat because the missionaries wrote it down wrong. So when they were, colonizing our people, they would baptize us and give us new names and write down some of our old Indian names. And NoiseCat was originally actually Noisket, which is an old Secwepemc, an old Salish name. It's in fact, the meaning of it has been forgotten because of colonization. I can give like an educated guess based on my knowledge of the language, but nobody actually really knows the story of the name and what it means. Um, and when my dad was found and then survived, he was raised by his grandmother, a woman named Alice Noiskit, who was the last person before him to carry that name. And then when my dad married my mom, who was a white woman, it turns out actually either party in a marriage can change their name. It doesn't have to be the woman. Like legally, either party is actually allowed to change their name. And so my dad wanted to reclaim one of his, names, because the name that he was stuck on our family, Archie, was a name put on us by colonizers, kind of like Malcolm X changing his name to Malcolm X. Um, and so he decided to reclaim Noiskit, which had by then already become NoiseCat, not knowing, this is the other crazy part, the story of his own birth, because my father did not know that story until we set out to make sugarcane and me to write We Survived the Night. So in this crazy way, the story of my name is one of the meaning of the name, the story of the name being discovered
Mm.
in my father's survival. So I think there's a lot in there about Indian names, about survival, about meaning. Um, and I also think that, for me, all of these different things, I mean, both the unlikeliness of me being set out on the path, not choosing the path, but being set out on the path to make sugarcane and then to write We Survived the Night and the story of my father's name, I think it raises questions for me about um, what forces and things beyond ourselves, of ancestors, connections to the spirit world. Um, you know, my father was born right on the precipice of life and death.
Mm,
And so, I think those all raise to me questions about spirituality, that extend beyond the usual secular approaches to nonfiction storytelling. In nonfiction,
mm,
we usually search for investigative, historical, social, scientific hard facts to explain, our narrative. And there's a lot of that in my work. Just to be clear, Sugarcane follows a groundbreaking investigation that was the first major work to ever document a pattern of infanticide at one of these schools. In We Survived the Night, I combine lots of different forms of nonfiction reporting and research and investigation. And yet, I think that there's an element wherein if you're ever asking questions about survival, about our connection to ancestors and what might lie beyond, where to me, secular approaches fall short of addressing some of those things. And I think that we have to leave open the possibility that spiritual acknowledgement of the spiritual reality of life, and spiritual explanations, which by the way have always had a space in indigenous storytelling and other storytelling traditions, maybe they deserve a place
yeah.
within our narratives.
Yeah, and I want to get more into the spirituality of your story and how that played a role in reconciling with your father. But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit more about the school. I mean, this is a school where abuse hardly seems to capture what was going on. I mean, what was going on was torture, rape, and murder of children. And there's one scene that struck me so much from the film where there's a guy, he's maybe like 60 years old, and he's talking about being forced to go to confession with a priest. And then he says, the same priest that takes your confession is the guy who rips you out of bed at night.
Hmm.
That was just so haunting. And I also say that, like, we sit here today, I think, as this very podcast is being recorded, there's a vote going on about whether to release the Epstein files in Congress. And,
Hmm.
there's a whole huge important narrative in our culture about believing women and Me Too. And I just would say, like, as a man, while I'm always have been sympathetic towards such terrible stories, when I saw in your film, it was the men, and not just any men, like real tough, you know, grown men talking about what happened to them in those schools. I would just say it hit me in a fresh and different way. And I was just wondering, just for a moment, what was it like for you to hear those men talking about what happened in those schools?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things there. I mean, firstly, I think it's also worth pointing out that this was a form of spiritual colonization, wherein one way of belief was the intention, the stated intention was to wipe out one way of belief in life and to replace it with another. And I think that in of itself is a pretty intense thing to set out to do to an entire race of people. And I just want to start there because we live in an era wherein there's a lot of sort of conspiracy theories and conspiratorial thinking out in the world, and I- it's sometimes hard for me to convey to people the extent to which this was a real world conspiracy,
Mm,
again, with by the way, elements of child abuse and pedophilia, that seem to be sort of a major strain of subconscious cultural obsession right now,
mm,
whether it be the Epstein files or QAnon or all these different sort of strands of thought that are out there in the broader culture. This was a real one that was perpetrated against an entire race of people across Canada and the United States, wherein an entire race of people were, for many generations, in some places for over 100 years, denied the right to raise their own children in their own homes, in their own communities, in their own cultures. And what happens when that occurs is, firstly, for us, an entire race of people were put into a situation wherein, children will tell you who were taken away to these schools that they didn't know what it was to be loved when they were
Mm,
a kid.
mhm.
And they grew up, of course, not having been parented, and so they themselves didn't really know how to do it. I mean, my dad, for example, didn't really. Both of his parents were taken away to these schools. He was born at one. He didn't really know how to be a dad when it came time to raise me and then my little sister. Um, and then, there is also an element of this that the sexual abuse of boys and girls at these schools was, especially at St. Joseph's, rampant. Actually, the very first sexual abuse criminal cases out of any schools in Canada came out of St. Joseph's Mission in Williams Lake.
Wow.
Um, and you're right to point out that actually a lot of the instances, not all of them, I mean, there was a lot of abuse of girls and teenage girls too, but a lot of them were abused boys. And I think that there's a lot in there. I think that there's, listen, part of my family is also Irish Catholic, and there was this old folk understanding that, if you're an Irish Catholic family, you had like 8 kids or something like that, you might send the one who was queer or whatever into the priesthood. And so I think that there was a lot of suppressed, um, and also like an entire group of men and women who were not allowed to express themselves sexually. Like weird stuff
Mhm,
happens.
mhm.
And also you have a group of young people who are vulnerable, who are viewed. I mean, the premise of the schools is that this is a lesser group of people who need to be assimilated so that they can fix their backwardness. And that kind of an idea, made many children susceptible. And then there was also a practice within the Catholic Church. It seems pretty clear, not just in the indigenous context, but elsewhere, of moving around
Yeah,
priests who, were messing with kids here and then would be moved elsewhere. And back then there was no internet, of course. So this new town, this new place, wouldn't know why this priest, this father, this brother, this nun was taken from here to this place. And in the archives that we looked at for sugarcane, there are examples of priests such as the late Chief Rick Gilbert, whose quote you brought up, um, his biological father being moved around, not just to schools in Canada, but actually also to schools in the United States,
mhm.
which I just bring up because the way that this story has been talked about sometimes, it's seen as a Canadian story. But in fact, there were 3 times as many schools in the United States. There's 139 in Canada, 417 in the United States. Those systems were not only influenced by each other, but also uh, in certain ways, kind of part of the same system. I mean, if
Yep,
if a if a Catholic priest from schools in Canada could be moved then to Catholic schools that were doing the same thing to Indian kids in the United States, I don't think that it's necessarily reasonable to describe that as a separate system in
yep,
certain instances.
yep,
And so, yeah, it was a really, really challenging thing to hear about, and to know that. Not only did this happen to elders and men in my community, but then, what often happened was that children who were abused, unfortunately, this is what happens, turned around and then themselves would become abusers as adults. And
yep,
so the cycles of abuse and violence and trauma from these schools, in many instances, continue in our communities today. And
yeah,
that is partially my father's story as well. I write about this in the book. He was raped by a survivor of one of those institutions.
yeah. One more question about the film before I move on to the book. It gets me thinking a lot about the timing of stories and when the world is ready to hear certain stories. You know, Harvey Weinstein had been a monster for decades, and then suddenly in 2017, the world was like, "We're ready to hear this story. We're ready for accountability." Black lives didn't matter the same way other lives mattered for centuries, and then George Floyd, and there's a flashpoint, and the world is ready to hear that story. Obviously, I'm simplifying things, but there is a way that, even in your film, there's a woman who says, "I tried to report the abuse,
Hmm.
and they told me to go here, and then I went there, and then they told me to go somewhere else." And she goes to like 6 different people, and then finally she ends up just telling her parents, and she gets the shit beat out of her. And it's like, the world was not ready to hear that story then, but it is ready now. I just find it an interesting thing about storytelling generally, the way the collective works and the way the zeitgeist is sometimes says, "Here I am, let's go with this story. Let's have accountability now." Whereas maybe even 5 years ago, for certain stories, it wasn't the right time. I'm just
Hmm.
kind of curious for your take on that.
Yeah, I think that culture itself goes through its own cycles. And then I think also, we don't often think generationally in Western society, but I often think that a generational lens on some of these things is actually really helpful.
Mm.
And so I bring those two things up because, when the discovery of the potential unmarked graves happened at the Kamloops Indian Residential School in May of 2021, I would say that it was in a moment in the cycles of culture, not that long after the police murder of George Floyd, wherein there was a general feeling in the zeitgeist that there was a openness to having harder conversations about histories of race and colonization. And, I would say that the discoveries of the unmarked graves were part of that general moment in time. And also, it was such a grim set of discoveries, child sized graves at schools across Canada, that it forced people to look at this history. And my sort of like dark take on that is like, apparently what it takes for the society to pay attention to and care about Indians is like finding out that, like, they were killing our children and abusing our children. Like, it takes that much for people to care
Yeah.
about us. um I would say generationally too, though. I think that there is something to the fact that we live at a moment in time where the last survivors of these institutions are now elders.
Mm.
This
Mm.
is like my grandparents' generation that we're talking about. And I think that that reality, you know, put a sort of created a sort of a demand, a need for this story to be told in this moment. And I think that there's something really important in that. I don't think that it's a coincidence, for example, that as the last living memories of World War II, of the Holocaust, of civil rights, are literally slipping from this world,
Mhm.
that now we are seeing, you know, a regression in liberal institutions, in civil rights, in commitments to international bodies that were created to prevent, genocide and mass atrocity and global conflict. Um, and, I think that that to me shows the importance of remembering these memories, remembering this history, and also of turning them into their own forms of, tradition that are honored and remembered and carried forward so that we do not, make these same mistakes over and over again. That is part of the reason why, societies create traditions in the first place. In Canada, they wear the remembrance pin for World War I to remember the people who fought, and also as a, sign to remember, like, hey, we gotta make sure that we don't enter into global conflict again.
Yeah. Let's move to the book. The book has a very interesting structure. It's part memoir, it's part myth, it's part kind of like cultural exploration, it's part history, it's part current reporting on current events. I'm just kind of curious, how did you come to this style of book? And on top of that, the book is sometimes referred to as it's told as a coyote story. Just tell us a little bit about what that means.
Well, so a coyote story is a form of trickster narrative, a form of creation story about the world, why it is the way it is, and how it came to be, that is told through an ancestor of my people, a trickster figure called Coyote, who was sent to the earth by Creator to set things in order, but was a trickster. And so while he did some good, he was often up to no good. So he fills the rivers with salmon, for example, and then populates the lands with descendants. But after filling the rivers with salmon, he turns around and uses the fish to try to marry into every single village along the river that will have him, because the coyote is a womanizer, among other things. And then after populating the lands with all these descendants, he kind of disappears and abandons us, because coyote is kind of the most epic deadbeat dad ever known to human history. um, and this is a tradition that, it's worth pointing out, was probably one of the widest ranging oral traditions in human history. Indigenous peoples all the way from Central America to Western Canada used to tell stories about the trickster coyote. But it's also a tradition that is waning, and nearly has died out in many parts of this continent, including among my people. I had actually only ever heard one member of my family ever tell a coyote story once in my entire life. And it was one of my uncles who, there's no real artful way to put this, but my grandfather was a bit of a womanizer himself, a bit of a coyote, so to speak. He had 19 kids and, didn't raise all of them. And so one of his kids was my father's older brother, this guy named Bucky, who was, you can maybe guess this based upon his name, but he was an Indian cowboy. um, and I heard him tell a coyote story once because he was knowledgeable in our culture, but he also died of cancer a few years ago. And so, this tradition, this oral storytelling tradition that uh, gets at so much of our culture and our world, is very nearly gone. And so I encountered the coyote stories a pretty unusual way, I guess. I was doing the research for the book. I was reading these old PDFs basically on like JSTOR that were full of, 100-year plus old ethnographies of my people, with our oral stories, the largest body of which were the coyote stories. And I had made this kind of unusual decision, probably for a 28-year-old bachelor at the time, which was to move in with my dad. And so, you just have to picture this. So I'm sitting there at my laptop, hunched over it, doing the research for We Survived the Night and working on Sugarcane, the documentary. My dad's an artist, and so he's out in the garage, you know, listening to Led Zeppelin, leaned over a log, adzing away, making his art because he's a carver, and taking rips from the bong. And he left our family when I was about 6 years old. So when I moved back in with him, this was us like reconnecting after a really complicated history. And he still owes me the money that I loaned him to come to my own high school
Oh
graduation,
my
just to give
God.
you a sense for the tragicomic reality of our relationship. Um, and I was reading these in the PDF. I was reading about my trickster ancestor Coyote, who was this great creator and destroyer and survivor, this epic deadbeat dad, mythic figure. And then I was looking out at the garage at this great trickster, creator, destroyer, survivor, epic deadbeat dad, my father. And then I was looking back at the PDF and back at the garage and back at the PDF and back at the garage. And all of a sudden, it just kind of clicked for me one day. I was like, oh
Mm,
my God, my father is the trickster coyote. Um,
mm,
and that insight fundamentally transformed the book I was writing. And of course it did, because the coyote is a transformer. That's what he does. And so suddenly I started asking myself this question of, would it be possible to write a nonfiction book that took the coyote stories, my people's most significant body of oral literature, seriously as nonfiction, the way that my ancestors did? And
mhm,
so I'd never seen that done before, and I wanted to try it, which required me to weave together memoir, family history, and reporting from across Indian country and Canada, the United States, with these coyote stories to create what I sort of describe and feel to be a woven narrative of self, of family, of community, and of this indigenous world, wherein I see still many echoes of the trickster and the ideas running through the stories about him, not only in my father and my grandfather, but in myself. And then also in the world more broadly, in the environmental and cultural transformations that we are going through. And also, I would say, in the political scene, wherein, there are many tricksters who are right now, you know, pulling off some pretty significant tricks as part of their whole, ploy for power. And in that sense, I think what I'm trying to say with this is that this tradition that was, by the way, nearly wiped off the face of the earth by schools like St. Joseph's Mission, that has nearly been forgotten entirely, actually still gets at the truth of this world and demands to be taken seriously as nonfiction, which it never has been.
Yeah.
I went to a university where we had to study the great books of Western civilization as part of the core curriculum. And would it have been so hard for us to read a 5 to 10 page coyote story
Mm.
alongside, the Iliad and the Odyssey and, Virginia Woolf? I don't think so. And why is it so hard for us to recognize that this continent and its peoples actually contributed something really meaningful to our understanding of humanity and the world?
Yeah. One of the best parts of the book for me, one of the deepest parts, one of the most moving parts of the book is, you have this great insight about how your father is the trickster, your father is the coyote. But to me, like, on top of that, what's going on is that this myth is not only like describing a truth, but it's doing some real emotional work for you. And it's allowing you to see your father in a new light. And frankly, what seems to me a more forgiving light. I mean, there's sort of a kind of a more rigid, more standard set of morals that might say, well, your father was a difficult and complicated man who didn't really raise you and who you hardly saw for most of your childhood. And you could say, well, maybe the fault is his. But I mean, I'm just saying kind of the most simple moral judgment could be made on that level. But here you are using, in how I read the book, this coyote myth to kind of forgive him and be like, wait a second, like this he is behaving in a way that is like part of some deeper truth, something that's far. You come to a kind of far deeper understanding of him through this myth, and that has great emotional power for you and allows you to reconcile. That aspect of the book I found really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. We, in the dominant society, I think, are g- given a lot of narratives that are a little bit straightforward, in my opinion. It's kind of black and white. It's clear who the good guys are, who the bad
Right.
guys are. It's clear who is good and who is evil. And in the trickster traditions, and definitely in the coyote stories, there is this understanding. And is grappling with the moral complexity of the world. These traditions, despite being oral traditions, are actually quite capacious. They're very wide ranging.
Mhm.
And in the trickster figure themselves, there is an acknowledgement of the contradictions inherent. The trickster is a supernatural figure, but there is in the trickster's character an acknowledgement of the contradictions in our human nature. So, at the same time as Coyote is like Robin Hood. He's stealing from, in the story of him leading the salmon up the river for the first time. He steals the salmon from these two witches who have been catching and keeping all the fish for themselves at the beginning of time, which, by the way, is like, obviously a bad thing to do. And the message, one of the environmental messages in this story, is pretty straightforward. It's don't catch all the fish. It's kind of a dick move. But which, by the way, like, modern commercial industrial fisheries have gotten that one wrong around the world
Mm,
for the last few hundred years. And
yeah.
yet, indigenous peoples, for thousands of years, sustained fisheries that not only could we have caught all the fish, but we actually sustained the fishery in such a way that, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada will tell you that before 1900, a big run of sockeye salmon on the Fraser River, which is the river that my people come from, could number 100 million sockeye.
Mm.
Now, the like largest run on record since has been like 20 million. Um, and that's just one species of 5 Pacific salmon species found in that river. In our oral histories, we talk of a time when our ancestors could walk bank to bank on the backs of salmon, which may be a little bit more literal than metaphorical. Um, and so, in these stories, Coyote is stealing the salmon and feeding our people, because back in the day, we used to derive about half of our calories from the salmon any given year. And at the same time, he's not doing it for altruistic reasons. He's doing it because he's the coyote. He's trying to enlarge his own, his own legend.
Yeah.
He's out there trying to marry as many women as will possibly have him, and trying to have as many descendants as he possibly can, and to build as great a myth for himself as he possibly can build. And I think there's an acknowledgement in the story that, on the one hand, these are kind of despicable qualities. Like, the point of the story is to tell our children, in every instance, the coyote is an example to our children of how not to be in the story. And yet, he's also the second only to creator in our account of creation, which I think leaves room for this interpretation that is both like, this is how not to be, and yet the contrary, the things that are backwards, the things that are sometimes self-serving, do in fact play a role in making the world the way it is, which, I don't know. I mean, to me, that gets pretty damn close to the truth of the world as I have seen and experienced it.
Yeah.
And, to me, that moral outlook demands to be taken seriously. And if you're dubious on that, consider this. The place where our Secwepemc people situate the fish trap that Coyote breaks and leads the salmon up the river from is actually the exact same place where experts will tell you 11,000 years ago, there was in fact an ice dam that held up a series of glacial lakes across the interior of what is now British Columbia. And 11,000 years ago, that ice dam really did break in what scientists call a Jokeljap. That's an ice dam flood in Icelandic, which formed the present course of the Fraser River, which was then populated by the salmon. So, in this oral tradition, an unwritten tradition that was passed down mouth to ear, generation after generation for thousands of years, there is a human memory thousands of years older than the pyramids, thousands of years older than the Bible, that correctly pinpoints an environmental transformation linked to the last era of climate change on this earth. And I just think that that kind of tradition demands to be taken seriously as nonfiction.
I mean, it's like the story of the flood in the Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty remarkable stuff, in my opinion. And interestingly, now there is a body of sort of geological study called geomorphology, which is basically about, you brought up floods, which is basically about how water shapes the land. And in that study, they are now starting to take more of these oral traditions, which, get at flood stories and environmental transformations, etc., seriously as sources.
Yeah. One last question on the coyote myth. You are part of the book is also kind of your own struggles to find out who you are. And, your father was one aspect of his life you talk about is how he was in relationships and how he had, children by different women. And you've talked about, kind of, just to take one part of your life, like your struggles in that, like, sort of, are you somebody who's destined to have a kind of be a more traditional family man, or is there something else more along the lines of your father that, is calling to you? And I guess my question to you is just, has this, your exploration of the coyote myth and, the way that you take it so seriously, kind of on par with, other religious traditions, and kind of, you take its psychological insight as being, speaking to a deeper truth. Do you feel like it's helped you understand yourself? Like, sort of, do you feel like if you kind of become more forgiving of who you are? And the next step I would take beyond that is, like, are we all coyotes? And, like, should all human beings of all cultures just look at themselves and can they learn to forgive themselves and even kind of become better people in a way by accepting the coyote part of themselves?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and is actually one of the core questions in the book that I'm kind of exploring around myself and, my relationship to my father and my grandfather. Um, Interestingly, the coyote stories, as I said, were for our children an example of how not to be, which is such another interesting parallel with my father and grandfather, because for the vast majority of my life, I looked to my dad as kind of my example of who I did not want to become, which
Mm.
I think is not that unusual of a thing for sons with fathers, especially if you have an estranged kind of relationship. You kind of like are hoping to become anything other than that. Um, which was exactly how our people thought about the coyote. And yet, as I write in the book, my father was an alcoholic. I'm now 5 years sober, but I struggled with my relationship to alcohol in my 20s. I put myself and other people in dangerous situations. I found myself becoming someone who I didn't want to be. I remember looking at photos of myself and being like, oh my God, like I'm getting like this sort of puffy, you know,
Mm.
enlarged face that I remembered my father having when he was, drinking pretty heavy. Um, and so, and I even had like blood tests that were starting to come back with like high levels of things associated with drinking a lot. And so, there was definitely an element of the coyote stories which I encountered in writing this book for the first time, really, and started grappling with for the first time, that gave me a language to understand these things that are
Mm.
both part of ourselves and things that we don't want to become, but also to have maybe some space of acknowledgement for that.
Yeah.
And a big one for me is honestly has been my relationship to women. In the book, in a section called Indian Acts, I write about what it has been like for me as a child of two worlds. My father's native, my mom is a white woman, which has created a complicated, among other things, dating situation for me. Because in Canada, uh, there's this thing called the Indian Act, which governs who does and does not count as Indian.
Mm.
Um, and Indians are the only people in North America who still have our racial purity legislated in this way. But basically, under the Indian Act, if I do not have a child with someone who is also considered an Indian under the Indian Act, so even if I had a kid with an American Indian, my kids won't count as Indian because I'm
Wow.
what's called a 6'2" Indian. Unfortunately, not in height. That's a legal designation, not the. I'm more like 5'11" and a half. Um, but and that has created a set of really significant complexities for me in dating. On the one hand, I went off and got educated and have made a career to a certain extent in sort of the white world, so to speak, and yet I want to preserve my culture and my legal rights as a native person, my treaty rights and these sorts of things. And that means that I have to have kids with a native person who has status under the Indian Act in Canada if I want that
Mm.
to remain true. And so, and also, sort of walking in two worlds for much of my young adulthood, it was possible for me to have like, during the school year, I might have a girlfriend in college or high school, and then I'd be, on the road going to powwows and living my life in the summer with my family in the Indian world, and I might have a girlfriend there too.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a pattern. I didn't really recognize it until many years down the road. Um, Actually, kind of echoed my own grandfather,
Yeah.
who, himself, as I mentioned, had 19 children that I could name with seven different women. Um, and, I think that if I look at many of the men in my family who have struggled with that, the coyote is in certain ways he's an account of the id unbridled. In
Hmm.
not to be vulgar, but in the stories he's kind of constantly feasting and use another word here, fucking, uh, and tricking and getting tricked, and he's just kind of chasing his appetites all around the
Yeah.
world. That's kind of
Yeah.
what the coyote is. That's kind of what tricksters are. Actually, there's a famous book that makes the case that that is what the trickster is. It's just the appetite unbridled on the world.
Yeah.
And I think that there's an acknowledgement that that is a something that needs to be tamed in the story, but it's also there's an acknowledgement that sometimes has a creative or can be a driving force in life and the world. And I think that figuring out the right relationship to that, that is in my bloodline. If you take the story seriously, like my grandfather was that, my father had elements of that, and all the way back to the coyote, that's been in my bloodline. And yet, on the other hand, like to be human is to figure out a healthy relationship to those kinds of things. And I think that that's kind of the place I find myself in now. I mean, I'll bring this up on this podcast because I've put it out into my social media world now. But me and my girlfriend are actually expecting a kid. You know,
Hey,
yeah.
congratulations! It's
Thank you.
amazing.
Yeah. So, I obviously I want to be a good dad, a present father for that kid, and I know how messed up it was for me to see my dad off, doing whatever, and I know how hard it was for my grandmother and my father's generation to see their dad off doing whatever, and that's a cycle that I want to break. At the same time as I know that
Mm.
like I have that potential, that blood, that gene, that coyote thing inside me. And I think if we're honest, I think that I don't know if the entire world has it, but I think a whole heck of a lot of it does.
Yeah, but what's interesting to me about it is that in Christianity, which is the tradition I was brought up in, there's just nothing really like that. I mean, there's ways that Jesus is a trickster. He's very clever, and he's always like pulling little tricks to kind of get his wisdom across. But it's not quite like, I mean, Jesus, at least in the Bible, is not sleeping around and being lazy and in this kind of way that the coyote is like so charming and funny. I don't know, maybe in some ways, like the devil is a kind of trickster, kind of an id unbridled. But it just struck me so much. I felt like the myth of the coyote, as you talk about it, is speaking to a reality of, the human condition that I just feel like is a little bit absent in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
I think that's right. And I think that interestingly also, there's this whole body of oral literature that I find fascinating, wherein some of our ancestors were learning about Christian theology because the missionaries were in our area, and they were putting it in conversation with the trickster narrative and our own
Mm-hmm.
creation stories. And firstly, I just want to point out that that is not something that was reciprocated on the missionary side of things.
Mm-hmm.
The
Yeah.
missionaries were kind of like, it's our way or the highway. It was an either
Right.
or, black and white, zero sum kind of game. For us, we had a more pluralistic relationship to mythology and story and creation. We were willing to accommodate other narratives and beliefs that were brought to us, and that was not just unique to us as indigenous people, as Secwepemc and Statling peoples. That's true actually all over the world. Indigenous peoples were often willing to incorporate new narratives and
Mm.
mythologies, and some of them are actually kind of funny. So there's one that I sort of quote from in the book that is collected in ethnography, where there's this I think his name was Quelqueltahen, which means like red hand, and he's telling
Mm-hmm.
the story about how the missionaries had told us about Creator's Son Jesus, and Jesus was really important in creation because he had taught us how to be good people. But he hadn't actually really done all that much in the creation of the world because he didn't provide food and he didn't vanquish the monsters and all this sort
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. And so while we were really grateful to Jesus, you know it was hard to say that he kind of paled in comparison to Coyote, who had fed us, and had
Mm-hmm.
rid the world of monsters, and had played all these significant and had died, by the way, many times and resurrected. That's the thing about one of the many things about Coyote is that he dies like constantly in the narratives, but
Yeah.
he always comes back.
Yeah.
So while Jesus had died and resurrected once, Coyote was like dying and resurrecting so many times that we never even bothered to keep count of his deaths and resurrections.
Yeah.
Um, and by the way, like just from a and so firstly, I think it's cool that those things were being put into conversation in that kind of way, which also had sort of a humor in it.
Yeah.
But like, there's also something in that notion of being a survivor that
Mm.
we are descended from a mythological trickster who might die but who was always going to come back. And I think that
Mm.
that message, especially for people who have been biologically, legally, and culturally imperiled because of colonization for hundreds of years now, is a very powerful one. Because, we are survivors, we are transformers. We might be counted out and considered dead, but we are always going to come back.
Wow, amazing. Your father, it's a strange thing, but even though I sort of intellectually knew that your father was still alive, thank God, there was a way that reading your book, when you would talk about him, I would be like, I can't believe he's still alive, because he was so, the relationship is so mythic and like described so beautifully that it almost seems like he is not of this world.
Mhm.
But anyway, it was, I read the book first and then watched the film, and it was so deeply satisfying to do it in that order, to kind of get to know your father in this deeper, more intimate way through the book, and then see him and see your
Mhm.
relationship truly evolving in real time in the documentary. But I just wanted to quickly ask before we wrap, like, you say your father, I mean, it's just so rich and so complicated between you two, but you describe him as a good hang. And it seems like you guys are sort of, you seems like you guys are sort of in a good spot. I mean, you went to the Oscars together, as all good fathers and sons ultimately do. But just tell me, like, where are you at now with your father, and kind of looking at the entire arc of things? Do you feel like, sort of having gone through all this with the film and the book, about him and all the research you did related to him and his life, what do you think that's done to your relationship today?
Well, firstly, I would just say that my dad and I are we probably consider us each other's best friends. And I have always seen him as this sort of mythic figure. And so the coyote stories and the opportunity to make him into a protagonist in a documentary and a film that has now been seen by people all over the world was an acknowledgement of a truth that I have always felt about him, which is that, he's this complicated mythic figure, which is
Yeah.
exactly who Coyote is, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would also say that if you read the book closely, you can't really see this in the documentary. But we lived together for 2 years while I
Mm-hmm.
made sugarcane and while I wrote We Survived the Night. And the reason I know all these stories about his life is because we were hanging out for 2 years. He'd be out making his art, and at the end of the day, we'd sit down and smoke some weed, as I wrote about in the New York Times Magazine. Which, by the way, like, I think it's the first time that they've ever allowed a Native man to write about smoking weed with his dad as a way to like heal from genocide. Which, representation
God.
is getting advanced here. We're pushing the boundaries of culture. Uh, and so, I think that in a certain sense, the book it tells a complicated story, but ultimately, the book itself and the documentary itself are evidence of the fact that me and my father lived together, shared space, reconciled, became each other's best friends for 2 years, which is how I even know these stories. And in my people's tradition, the way I've always seen people tell stories, first of all, it's often at a funeral. So it's interesting that you pointed out that you felt that he was this mythic sort of figure who might be gone, because so often I've seen people tell stories about each other at funerals. And what I
Mm-hmm.
see when my people tell stories about each other at funerals is, telling the story is evidence that you shared life and this time together on this earth that only you and this person maybe shared. That this
Mm-hmm.
story, of your wild times, your adventure here, this tragic thing that had happened to you, maybe even a pain that this person had caused you. Even when the story is complicated, the story itself, the act of telling the story, is a sign of love.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, to me, ultimately, I consider the book, absolutely, as well as the documentary, kind of an honor song to my father. And so it was so beautiful to get to share this beautiful and complicated feeling that I have about my own dad, with the world, and then to see it travel all the way to the Academy Awards, and to have this image, ingrained in my hippocampus of my coyote dad in his tuxedo with his cowboy hat on with the eagle feather in it, strutting his stuff on the red carpet with like Ariana Grande and the cast of Wicked, like, being chased by a gaggle of paparazzi in the background. And to me, like, I don't know. I'm just so grateful that that was a life experience that we got to share, and here we are, and I would say that we're pretty good.
Awesome. All right, let's do a quick question from the audience. We have time for one here. This is from Margaret. Anansi in Africa, fox spirit in Asia. What does Europe have in terms of the trickster? The original people that disappeared under the earth and became leprechauns is one. But is Loki sort of the trickster
I would say the
among them?
Vikings, yeah. So Loki would be one. In Ireland, they definitely have sort of a mythology, a trickster mythology that is reminiscent of trickster mythologies that you'll find around the rest of the world. I was with the Sami in Norway, the indigenous peoples of Scandinavia, back in
Mhm.
September. We screened our film out there. They were telling me about their trickster, and I can't remember their name, but they have one for sure. And I would say that, before Christianity, there was a set of, folk tales and mythology and beliefs, and I'm sure in those you would find figures who were um, similar to the trickster. And I think it's interesting to consider that maybe some of these even pre-literate, as they're sometimes described,
Mhm.
storytelling traditions actually were able to get at. Um, these complex truths about the world that are quite philosophically rich, quite literary, and that were, nearly plowed over by what was considered progress. But, if you look at it from another vantage point, maybe it wasn't. And maybe in certain ways, our human knowledge has not always expanded over time. Maybe in certain moments in time, there's actually been a great dying off, a great killing off, actually, of cultures and forms of storytelling and knowledge and tradition that get at things that might be worth remembering.
Yeah. Well, folks, the book is called We Survived the Night. Thank God you remembered all of this. I really want to genuinely say that it was one of the greatest documentary films I've ever seen. The book dovetails with it perfectly. And sort of, I feel like sometimes film is so rigorous and so limited in how much it can go into. The book sort of fleshed out so many beautiful and subtle and interesting aspects of the story. As somebody who loves father-son stories, I was just deeply moved by this book. Let me just ask you one last question, which I ask everybody who comes on the show, which is just imagine, Julian, the ideal reader for We Survived the Night, somebody who is just receiving the book in exactly the way you wished it would be received in your wildest dreams. Imagine that person has just finished the book. They close it, they look out the window. Tell us in a phrase or even just a single word, how does that reader feel?
Hmm. I hope that they feel like their heart and conscience has been expanded
Mm,
to include a vocabulary that can, get at so much of the beauty and complexity of the human experience.
mhm,
And I think there's like the hope that people might learn more about indigenous peoples, but I also think that there's something more universal that I would like for this book to do for people. And indigenous peoples are so rarely given the opportunity to be seen as
mm.
examples of the universal. In fact, we're often seen as the antithesis of that. So I hope that there's like an appreciation and love for the complicated thing that it is to be a human, to be a son, to be a relative on this earth.
My goodness. What an interview. Oh my God. This is it's so beautiful. Everything that came out today was just so beautifully said. Julian, thank you so much for coming on the show. I know you're busy. You're having like the best year ever, and I hope it keeps going. I hope even more great things come your way.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it, man.
All right, everybody, thank you for joining. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we'll see you next week on Thoughtful Bro.